I'm Margaret, 32 years old, and I'm sitting in my corner office on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper staring at the platinum credit card in my hand. The city lights twinkle below me like diamonds scattered across black velvet, but all I can think about is what my mother said at last year's family gathering. Margaret will never amount to anything. Always working late, always chasing dreams that don't pay the bills. Well, Mom's 60th birthday is tomorrow night, and they have absolutely no idea what's coming their way. Before I tell you how I completely turned the tables on my own family at a dinner that changed everything forever, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that will leave you absolutely speechless. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. Let me paint you a picture of my family because understanding them is crucial to understanding why that night hit so hard. My mother Linda is 60 years old, works as a bookkeeper at a small accounting firm in Queens, and has spent my entire life believing that success can only be measured in terms she understands. My father Harold is 62, a retired mechanic who worked his hands to the bone for 40 years and thinks anything that doesn't involve getting dirty isn't real work. Then there's my younger sister Beverly, 28 years old, married to Tom, who works as an assistant manager at the local First National Bank branch. Beverly has 2 kids, stays home full-time, and in my parents' eyes, she represents everything a daughter should be. Settle down early gave them grandchildren never questioned the path that was laid out for her. She lives in a 3-bedroom ranch house in Astoria that my parents helped them buy, drives a 7-year-old Honda Accord, and clips coupons every Sunday morning like it's a religious ritual. My youngest sibling Dennis is 26, works as a car salesman at Jerry's Auto Plaza on Northern Boulevard, and has never met a commission check he couldn't spend before he earned it. He's got that natural charm that makes people want to buy whatever he's selling, but he's also got the financial planning skills of a teenager with their first credit card. Dennis lives in a studio apartment above a pizza place in Elmhurst, drives whatever car he can get the best deal on from the lot, and changes girlfriends about as often as he changes his sales targets. Growing up in our cramped 3-bedroom house on 47th Avenue in Woodside, I was always the odd one out. While Beverly played with dolls and helped Mom in the kitchen, I was reading business magazines I'd stolen from the library. While Dennis was charming his way out of trouble and making friends with every kid in the neighborhood, I was studying for AP classes and applying to colleges that none of them had ever heard of. The conflicts started early and never really stopped. When I got into Northeastern University in Boston, my parents spent months complaining about the cost and asking why I couldn't just go to Queens College like a normal person. When I chose marketing as my major, my father actually laughed and said, "So you're going to college to learn how to lie to people for a living." When I graduated and took my first job at a small agency in Manhattan, making $28,000 a year, they acted like I was throwing my life away for pennies. The criticism never stopped, it just evolved. When I worked late to prove myself at my first job, I was called a workaholic with no sense of balance. When I moved to Brooklyn Heights to be closer to work, they said I was wasting money on rent when I could live at home for free. When I got promoted to account manager, then senior account manager, then marketing director, they always found a way to diminish it. Corporate jobs these days, you never know when they'll just eliminate your position, my mother would say, as if working for someone else was inherently more stable than entrepreneurship. The worst part wasn't the lack of support, it was the constant comparison. Beverly's husband got another promotion at the bank, my mother would announce every time we talked. Dennis sold 15 cars last month, he's really making something of himself. Meanwhile, my achievements were always qualified. Margaret got another promotion, but you know how those corporate jobs are here today, gone tomorrow. By the time I turned 30, I had stopped trying to explain my career to them. When they asked what I did for work, I'd just say marketing and change the subject. When they made assumptions about my salary or my lifestyle, I'd let them believe whatever made them comfortable. It was easier than fighting a battle I could never win, easier than trying to translate my world into terms they would understand or respect. But that silence came with a cost. They had built this entire narrative about my life based on their assumptions and their limitations. In their minds, I was the family disappointment, the daughter who chose career over family, who worked too much for too little, who was probably struggling financially but too proud to admit it. They had no idea that their assumptions were not just wrong, they were laughably wrong. The planning for Mom's 60th birthday started 3 weeks before the actual date, and from the very first phone call, I could feel the familiar pattern beginning. Beverly called me on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was about to ask for something she wasn't sure I could deliver. "Hey, Margaret, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," she began, which we both knew meant she absolutely knew she was catching me at a bad time, but was going to proceed anyway. "I wanted to talk to you about Mom's birthday. She's turning 60, which is a big one, and Tom and I were thinking we should do something really special for her." I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair, already knowing where this conversation was headed. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, we found this beautiful Italian restaurant in Little Italy called Russo's. It's upscale, really elegant, the kind of place Mom would never take herself, but would absolutely love. The thing is, it's not exactly cheap. We're looking at maybe $40 to $60 per person depending on what everyone orders." I did the quick math in my head. 7 people, $60 each. We were looking at over $400 just for dinner. "That sounds lovely, Beverly. I'm sure Mom would enjoy someplace special." "Oh, good. I was hoping you'd be on board. So here's what Tom and I were thinking. If everyone chips in $100, that should cover dinner and drinks and tip and everything, maybe even a nice bottle of wine for the table." I was about to agree when Beverly continued, her voice taking on that slightly apologetic tone that meant she was about to say something she knew would irritate me. "Actually, we were thinking maybe you could contribute $150 instead of $100. Since you don't have kids or a mortgage or anything, you probably have more disposable income than the rest of us." I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I'd been getting from my family for the past decade whenever money came up. They had no idea what my financial situation actually was, but they felt completely comfortable making assumptions and then asking me to pay more based on those assumptions. $150 is fine, Beverly," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Great. I'll make the reservation for Saturday night at 7. Oh, and Margaret, maybe don't mention the extra 50 to Dennis and Mom and Dad. You know how they get about money stuff." After Beverly hung up, I sat in my office for a long time looking out at the Manhattan skyline and trying to process the conversation. They wanted me to pay more because they assumed I had more disposable income, but they also wanted me to hide the fact that I was paying more, presumably to protect everyone else's feelings. It was the perfect encapsulation of my relationship with my family. Give more, expect less, and do it quietly, so nobody else has to feel uncomfortable. The text messages from Dennis started 2 days later, and they perfectly captured his particular brand of condescending charm. The first one came while I was in a strategy meeting with the senior partners, my phone buzzing insistently on the conference table. "Hey sis, hope you can afford your share of Mom's dinner, LOL. Don't worry if you're short, I can cover you this time. Sales have been really good lately." The second message came with a photo attached. It was a picture of Dennis's wrist showing off a new Fossil watch that probably cost around $200. "Just treated myself to some new hardware. When you're closing deals left and right, you gotta look the part, you know." The third message was the one that really got under my skin. "Seriously though, if the restaurant thing is too much for your budget, we can always do something simpler. No shame in being practical." I stared at those messages for a long time, feeling a familiar mixture of hurt and frustration. Dennis made maybe $45,000 a year on a good year, lived in a studio apartment that cost $800 a month, and had never had more than $3,000 in savings at any given time. But he felt completely comfortable offering to cover my portion of a family dinner because he'd bought himself a watch with his latest commission check. The conversation with my mother was the final straw. I had driven out to Queens the following Sunday, bringing flowers and a bottle of wine like I always did, hoping for a pleasant afternoon visit. Instead, I walked into an ambush disguised as maternal concern. "Margaret, honey, I hope you're not overextending yourself for this dinner," my mother said before I'd even taken my coat off. "I know these corporate jobs don't always pay as well as people think they do, and I'd hate for you to go into debt just for my birthday." I set the flowers on the kitchen counter and took a deep breath. "Mom, I'm fine. Really. It's just that your father and I have been talking, and we know how expensive it is to live in the city. That little apartment of yours must cost a fortune, and we see how hard you work all those late nights and weekends. It can't be easy making ends meet." She poured coffee into two mismatched mugs and sat down at the kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 18 years. The table was the same, the chairs were the same, even the salt and pepper shakers were the same ones from my childhood. But somehow I felt like a stranger sitting there. "Your siblings are doing so well," she continued, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate slowness. "Beverly's Tom got another promotion at the bank they're looking at upgrading to a bigger house next year. And Dennis, well, you should see his confidence these days. He sold 15 cars last month, made more money than he'd ever seen at one time." I nodded and sipped my coffee, waiting for the inevitable comparison. "It's just different for you, isn't it? All that education, all those years of school, and for what? These corporate jobs, they're so unpredictable. You work so much, but you never seem to get ahead. Maybe it's time to think about something more stable, something more traditional." I wanted to defend myself, wanted to explain that she had no idea what she was talking about, wanted to tell her exactly how wrong her assumptions were. But I also knew that having that conversation would require me to prove myself in ways that I shouldn't have to prove myself to my own mother. So instead, I finished my coffee, kissed her cheek, and drove home to Brooklyn with my jaw clenched and my hands gripping the steering wheel. That night, sitting in my apartment overlooking the Manhattan Bridge, I made a decision. I wasn't going to just pay my share of Mom's birthday dinner. I wasn't even going to pay the $150 that Beverly had suggested. I was going to pay for the entire meal, every single dollar, and I was going to make sure they all knew exactly who was picking up the tab. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes Manhattan feel electric with possibility. I had spent the afternoon getting ready, choosing my outfit carefully. A black wool dress that had cost more than Dennis made in a week, paired with leather boots that Beverly would probably assume were knockoffs from some discount store in Queens. I wanted to look successful, but not flashy confident, but not arrogant. I had no idea how dramatically the evening was about to unfold. Russo's Italian restaurant sat on a corner in Little Italy, like something out of a movie, with brick walls, ivy climbing towards second-story windows, and warm light spilling onto the sidewalk through large windows draped in white curtains. The kind of place that tourists found charming and locals knew was overpriced but worth it for special occasions. I arrived 15 minutes late intentionally and found my family already seated at a large round table near the back of the restaurant. My mother Linda sat at the head of the table wearing a navy blue dress I'd never seen before, her gray hair freshly styled, looking happier than I'd seen her in months. My father Harold wore the same dark suit he'd worn to every important family event for the past 15 years, his tie slightly crooked and his face carrying that expression of mild discomfort he always got in restaurants fancier than Applebee's. Beverly and her husband Tom sat to my mother's right. Beverly in a floral print dress that looked like it came from Target's professional wear section, Tom in a light blue button-down shirt and khakis that screamed suburban bank employee. Their two kids, 8-year-old Michael and 6-year-old Sarah, were coloring on the backs of their menus with crayons the hostess had provided. Dennis sat across from them with his current girlfriend Cheryl, a nurse at Queens General Hospital, who seemed nice enough, but had that slightly overwhelmed look that all of Dennis's girlfriends got after about 3 months of dating him. Dennis wore what he probably thought was a sophisticated outfit, a black shirt with gray slacks and those pointed toe shoes that car salesmen always seem to favor. "Margaret," Beverly called out as I approached the table, her voice carrying that forced enthusiasm she used when she was trying to smooth over potential awkwardness. "We were starting to wonder if you'd gotten lost." Traffic was brutal coming over the bridge, I lied, settling into the empty chair between my father and Cheryl. This place looks amazing. And it really did. White tablecloths, flickering candles, soft jazz playing in the background, and the kind of attentive service that made you feel like your table was the only one in the restaurant. The smell of garlic and basil and fresh bread filled the air, and I could see why Beverly had chosen this place. It was exactly the kind of restaurant my mother would love, but would never splurge on for herself. The menu looks incredible, my mother said, scanning the options with wide eyes. Everything sounds so fancy. I can't even pronounce half of these dishes. The prices are pretty fancy too, Dennis said with a laugh that was meant to sound casual but carried an undertone of anxiety. Good thing we're splitting this 7 ways, right, Margaret? I smiled and nodded, opening my own menu and pretending to study the options while I listened to the conversation flowing around me. It didn't take long for the familiar patterns to emerge. Dennis just leased a brand new car, Cheryl announced proudly, clearly still in the honeymoon phase of their relationship, where she thought his financial decisions were charming rather than concerning. A 2023 Honda Civic. It's gorgeous. Only $350 a month, Dennis added, puffing up with pride. And it's got all the latest technology. Bluetooth backup camera, the works. That's wonderful, honey, my mother said, beaming at her youngest son. You're doing so well for yourself. Tom cleared his throat importantly. Speaking of doing well, I got some good news at work this week. They're promoting me to senior assistant manager. Comes with a 15% salary bump and better benefits. Oh, Tom, that's fantastic, my mother exclaimed. Beverly, you must be so proud. Beverly blushed prettily and reached over to squeeze her husband's hand. We're actually looking at houses now. 4 bedrooms, maybe even a 2-car garage. The kids are getting bigger, and with Tom's promotion, we can finally afford to upgrade. I sat quietly sipping the water the waiter had poured, watching this familiar performance play out. Everyone taking their turn to share their good news, everyone getting their moment of praise and recognition from my parents. The unspoken assumption was that I would go last, if at all, and that whatever I shared would be somehow less impressive or less important than what had come before. What about you, Margaret? My father asked, his voice carrying that particular tone of polite inquiry that suggested he wasn't really expecting much of an answer. How are things at your job? Before I could respond, my mother jumped in with her own interpretation. Margaret's still in that little apartment in Brooklyn. Same place she's been for 3 years now. I keep telling her she should think about moving somewhere more affordable, maybe get a roommate to help with the rent. Still working those crazy hours, too, Dennis added, shaking his head with mock sympathy. Must be rough putting in all that time and still struggling to get ahead. All that student debt from college doesn't help either, I bet. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I kept my voice level. The hours aren't that bad, and I like my apartment. It's just hard to watch sometimes, Beverly said, her voice dripping with the kind of concerned condescension that made my teeth clench. You work so much harder than any of us, but you never seem to have anything to show for it. I worry about you spending all that time at the office for, well, whatever it is you actually do there. Marketing, I said quietly. Right, marketing, my father said, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice. In my day, hard work meant something concrete. You built something, you fixed something, you could see the results of your labor at the end of the day. These corporate jobs nowadays, it's all smoke and mirrors. Tom nodded sagely, as if my father had just shared some profound wisdom. Banking teaches you real money management skills. You learn to understand what money actually means, how to make it work for you. Not like those marketing gimmicks where you're just trying to convince people to buy things they don't need. The conversation continued around me, each comment landing like a small slap. They weren't being intentionally cruel, I realized. They genuinely believed they were being supportive, offering advice and sympathy to their struggling family member. The fact that their sympathy was based on assumptions that were completely wrong didn't make it hurt any less. The final straw came when the waiter approached to take our order. My mother looked around the table nervously, clearly doing math in her head as she scanned the prices on the menu. "Maybe we should stick to the pasta dishes," she said quietly. "Some of these entrees are quite expensive." "Mom, it's your birthday," Beverly protested. "You should get whatever you want." "I just don't want anyone to overextend themselves," my mother replied, her eyes landing on me with that look of maternal concern that made me want to scream. That's when Dennis decided to be helpful. "Don't worry, Mom. If anyone's short on cash, I can cover them. Sales have been really good lately and family comes first." He said it quietly, but not quietly enough. The table next to us had gone silent, and I could feel other diners glancing in our direction. My mother's face flushed pink with embarrassment, and I realized that this had gone far enough. "Actually," I said loud enough for the waiter to hear, "we'd like to see the wine menu, the expensive section." The entire table went quiet, staring at me with expressions ranging from confusion to concern. "Margaret, what are you doing?" Beverly whispered. "It's Mom's 60th birthday," I said, smiling at the waiter. "We want to do this right." The waiter, a professional in his 50s, who had probably seen every possible family drama play out in this restaurant, smoothly produced a leather-bound wine list and set it in front of me. I opened it, deliberately scanning the options while my family watched in growing alarm. "Actually, let's start with champagne," I announced, looking up at the waiter. "What's your best bottle?" "We have a lovely Dom Perignon 2015, he replied without missing a beat. "It's $240. I could hear Beverly's sharp intake of breath, but I nodded approvingly. "Perfect. We'll take that." "Margaret," my father said, urgently, leaning toward me, "that's more than some people spend on groceries in a month." "It's Mom's 60th, I replied calmly. "She deserves the best." Before anyone could protest further, I turned back to the waiter. "And for dinner, let's start with the seafood tower for the table. Then we'll have the lobster fra diavolo for everyone, and the Wagyu beef appetizer." The waiter nodded and made notes on his pad while my family sat in stunned silence. I was ordering dishes that cost $60 to $70 per person, plus appetizers and champagne that would bring the total to well over $1,000 for 7 people. "Margaret, honey," my mother said quietly, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "This is incredibly sweet, but we really should stick to something more reasonable. This is getting very expensive." "Don't worry about it, Mom," I said, gently pulling my hand away. "I've got this covered." "We can split it," Dennis said quickly, fumbling for his wallet. "I mean, I can contribute something. Maybe we all put in what we can, and you don't have to carry the whole thing yourself." I looked around the table at their concerned faces, at Beverly calculating costs in her head, at Tom looking genuinely worried about my financial well-being, at my parents exchanging glances that clearly communicated their fear that their daughter was about to bankrupt herself for the sake of a birthday dinner. "No splitting," I said firmly. "This one's on me." The champagne arrived with the kind of ceremony that expensive champagne deserves. The waiter presented the bottle. I nodded approval. He popped the cork with a satisfying sound that made half the restaurant turn to look at our table. 7 flutes of golden bubbles appeared as if by magic, and suddenly we were toasting my mother's birthday with champagne that cost more than Dennis's monthly car payment. "To Linda," I said, raising my glass. 60 years of keeping this crazy family together." Everyone drank, but I could see the worry in their eyes. They were convinced they were watching me make a terrible financial mistake, possibly going into debt for years just to prove some kind of point. In their minds, I was the struggling corporate drone trying to keep up appearances, spending money I didn't have to impress people who would love me regardless. The appetizers arrived like small works of art, the seafood tower rising 2 feet above the table, laden with oysters and shrimp and crab legs that none of us really knew how to eat properly. The Wagyu beef came sliced paper thin, arranged on small plates with exotic garnishes that looked too beautiful to disturb. "This is incredible," my mother whispered, her eyes wide as she took her first bite of beef that probably cost more per ounce than she spent on groceries in a week. "I've never tasted anything like this." "It's amazing what money can buy," my father said, and I couldn't tell if he was being sarcastic or genuinely impressed. That's when I decided it was time to stop letting them make assumptions about my life. I reached into my purse and pulled out my business card, setting it on the table where everyone could see it. The thick cardstock, the embossed lettering, the company logo that anyone in the business world would recognize immediately. "What's Morrison and Associates?" Dennis asked, picking up the card and examining it like it might contain some kind of hidden message. "It's where I work," I replied, taking a sip of champagne and enjoying the moment before the bomb dropped. "I thought you worked for some small marketing company," Beverly said, looking confused. "I did for the first 5 years of my career. Morrison and Associates is a Fortune 500 consulting firm. I manage the Northeast region." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear conversations from 3 tables away. 7 pairs of eyes stared at me like I had just announced that I was secretly an astronaut. "What does that mean exactly?" Beverly asked quietly. "It means I'm responsible for all marketing strategy and implementation for clients from Boston to Washington, D.C. It means I manage a team of 15 people. It means I travel to corporate headquarters in Chicago once a month and present quarterly reports to the board of directors." Tom, who understood corporate hierarchies better than the rest of them, was doing calculations in his head. "How many people work for Morrison and Associates?" "About 8,000 employees worldwide. The Northeast region handles roughly $200 million in annual revenue." Dennis set down his champagne flute with a hand that was noticeably shaking. "Margaret, what exactly do you make?" I had been waiting for this question for 10 years. Every family gathering where they assumed I was struggling, every comment about my apartment or my job or my lifestyle choices, every time they treated me like the family member who needed help instead of the one who was succeeding beyond their wildest imagination. "My base salary is $95,000, I said, watching their faces change as the number sank in. "With performance bonuses, I cleared $140,000 last year." The silence this time was different. It wasn't confusion or concern. It was shock, followed by the slow realization that everything they thought they knew about my life was completely wrong. My mother's face went through a series of expressions from disbelief to embarrassment to something that might have been pride if it wasn't so mixed up with shame. My father stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Beverly and Tom exchanged a look that clearly communicated their sudden understanding that I made more money than both of them combined. Dennis looked like someone had just told him that his struggling big sister was actually a millionaire. But the thing that surprised me most was how I felt in that moment. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just tired. Tired of hiding who I was to make them comfortable. Tired of pretending that their assumptions were anything other than insulting. Tired of being treated like the family failure when I was actually the biggest success story any of us had ever produced. The aftermath of my revelation unfolded like a slow-motion car crash, with each family member processing the information at their own speed and in their own way. Dennis was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're lying," he said, but there was no conviction behind the words. "There's no way you make that much money." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, turning the screen toward him without saying a word. The checking account balance showed $47,000. The savings account showed $82,000. The investment portfolio summary showed numbers that made his eyes go wide. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Beverly asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hurt and confusion. I set my phone back down and looked around the table at their faces. When exactly should I have told you, between the comments about my little apartment and my meaningless corporate job, or maybe during one of those conversations where you all assumed I was struggling and offered to help me out financially? "We just thought," my father started, then trailed off, apparently realizing that anything he said would only make things worse. "You thought wrong," I said simply. "About everything." The waiter chose that moment to bring our entrees, 7 plates of lobster fra diavolo, that looked like they belonged in a food magazine, each one representing more money than most families spent on dinner in a month. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that we were sitting in front of the most expensive meal any of them had ever eaten, paid for by the family member they had all assumed couldn't afford it. "Margaret," my mother said quietly, her voice shaking slightly, "we never meant to make you feel like we didn't respect your work. We just didn't understand what you did." "Not understanding and not bothering to ask are two different things," I replied, cutting into my lobster with more force than was strictly necessary. Beverly tried a different approach. "But you never talked about work. You never told us about promotions or salary or any of it. How were we supposed to know?" "I stopped talking about work because every time I did, you found a way to dismiss it or minimize it or turn it into a comparison with what Dennis and Tom were doing. Do you remember when I got promoted to marketing director 3 years ago?" Beverly looked uncomfortable. "I remember you mentioning something about a new position." "I mentioned that I had been promoted to director level at a Fortune 500 company, that I was managing a team of 12 people, and that I was getting a company car." "Do you remember what Mom said?" The table had gone quiet again, everyone focused intently on their food while trying to listen to a conversation that was clearly going to get more uncomfortable before it got better. She said, "Well, that's nice, dear. But you know how these corporate jobs are. Here today, gone tomorrow. At least when Tom gets promoted at the bank, you know it's secure." Tom stopped eating and looked up at me with an expression of dawning realization. "You were trying to share good news and you dismissed it," I finished. "Just like you dismissed everything else I ever accomplished. My apartment isn't little, by the way. It's a one-bedroom in Brooklyn Heights with a view of Manhattan Bridge. The rent is $2,800 a month, and I chose it specifically because I could afford it comfortably on my salary." Dennis had been doing math in his head, and the color was slowly draining from his face. $2,800 a month? That's more than I make in 2 months. Your car payment is $350 a month for a Honda Civic." I continued, feeling a decade of frustration pouring out of me all at once. "My car payment is $450 a month for a BMW 3 Series. The difference is that I never felt the need to brag about it or use it to make anyone else feel bad about their choices." Cheryl, who had been quietly observing this family drama unfold, finally spoke up. "Dennis told me you were struggling financially. He said the family was worried about you." Dennis turned bright red and started to protest, but I held up a hand to stop him. "It's fine, Cheryl. It's not your fault that my family created an entire fictional narrative about my life without ever bothering to ask me about the reality." My mother was crying now, quiet tears sliding down her cheeks as she processed the magnitude of their collective misunderstanding. "We're proud of you, honey. We've always been proud of you. We just didn't know how to show it. You could have started by not assuming that I was failing just because my success didn't look like what you expected success to look like." The rest of the dinner passed in relative quiet, with everyone mechanically eating their expensive food while processing the conversation we just had. The lobster was perfectly prepared. The wine was exceptional, and the service was impeccable. But the mood at the table had shifted completely. When the check arrived, it totaled $847. The waiter set it discreetly beside my plate, and I could see everyone else at the table trying not to look at it while obviously calculating the numbers in their heads. Beverly reached for her purse. "Margaret, this is too much. We need to split this." "I told you it was my treat," I said, pulling out my American Express Platinum card. The metal card caught the candlelight as I set it on top of the bill, and I saw Dennis's eyes widen as he recognized what it was. "Is that a Platinum card?" he asked quietly. "You have to have a pretty substantial income to qualify for one of those." Tom added, his banker's training showing. I smiled for the first time all evening. "You need to make at least $75,000 a year just to be considered for the basic version. The Platinum requires significantly more." As the waiter processed my payment, I looked around the table at my family. They all looked shell-shocked, like they were seeing me for the first time, and trying to reconcile this new version of Margaret with the one they had constructed in their minds. The walk to the parking garage after dinner was awkward in a way that family interactions had never been before. Usually, our post-dinner conversations were filled with compliments about the food and plans for the next family gathering. Tonight, everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells, unsure how to process what had just happened or what it meant for our relationships going forward. My mother linked her arm through mine as we walked, something she hadn't done since I was a child. "Margaret, honey, I owe you an apology. We all do." "It's fine, Mom," I said, but we both knew it wasn't really fine. "No, it's not fine," Beverly interjected, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk so abruptly that Tom nearly walked into her. "We've been treating you like the family charity case for years, and you've been making more money than any of us. That's not fine. That's embarrassing." Dennis, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since we left the restaurant, finally spoke up. "I feel like a complete idiot. All those times I offered to cover your share of things or suggested we do something cheaper so you could afford it. God. Margaret, you must have thought I was such an ass." "I thought you were trying to be helpful in your own way," I replied, which was more charitable than how I had actually felt in those moments. "But you never corrected us," my father said, and I could hear the confusion in his voice. "Why didn't you just tell us what you really made? Why let us keep making assumptions?" I stopped walking and turned to face all of them standing under a streetlight in Little Italy with the sounds of the city humming around us. Because I shouldn't have had to prove my worth to you with a salary figure. Because family love shouldn't come with conditions or require financial justification. Because you should have respected my choices and my life, regardless of how much money you thought I was making. The silence that followed was different from the shocked silence at the restaurant. This was the silence of people who were beginning to understand the depth of their mistake. "You're absolutely right," Tom said quietly. "And I apologize. I made assumptions about your job without knowing anything about your actual situation." "We all did," Beverly added. "But Margaret, you have to understand you never talked about work in specifics. You never mentioned your salary or your promotions or any of the details that would have helped us understand what you were actually accomplishing." I stopped sharing details because every time I did, you found a way to minimize them or compare them unfavorably to what everyone else was doing. It became easier to just say, "Work is fine," and change the subject. My mother squeezed my arm. "We failed you, didn't we? We were so busy worrying about what we thought your problems were that we never celebrated what your successes actually were." Cheryl, who had been quietly observing our family dynamics all evening, offered a perspective from the outside. "It sounds like there were a lot of miscommunications on both sides. Dennis talks about your family all the time, and he's always worried about Margaret because he loves her and wants her to be happy. Maybe the worry got translated into assumptions that weren't accurate." "The road to hell is paved with good intentions," I said not unkindly. "But intentions don't change the impact of actions." We had reached the parking garage, and the conversation was naturally coming to an end. Everyone seemed to be processing the evening in their own way, trying to figure out how to move forward from this point. "So what happens now?" Dennis asked. "Do we just pretend this never happened? Or do we need to have some kind of big family meeting to hash everything out?" "What happens now is that things change," I said firmly. "I'm done being treated like the family failure or the struggling sister who needs help. I'm done with the assumptions and the comparisons and the subtle put-downs disguised as concern." "What do you want from us?" Beverly asked, and I could hear the genuine desire to make things right in her voice. "I want you to respect my choices, even if you don't understand them. I want you to ask about my life instead of making assumptions about it. I want you to celebrate my successes instead of finding ways to minimize them. And I want you to stop treating me like I need your pity or your financial assistance." My father, who had been unusually quiet throughout this entire conversation, finally spoke up. "Margaret, I want you to know that your old man is proud of you. I may not understand what you do for work, but I understand that you're good at it and that you've built something impressive. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like that wasn't enough." It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever heard from my father, and it meant more to me than I expected it would. I love you all, I said, looking around at their faces in the dim light of the parking garage. But love isn't enough if it doesn't come with respect. And respect means accepting me as I am, not as you think I should be. The weeks following Mom's birthday dinner brought changes to our family dynamic that I hadn't expected. It started with small things like Beverly calling to ask specific questions about my work, instead of making vague comments about corporate jobs. She wanted to understand what a marketing director actually did, what kinds of decisions I made, what my typical day looked like. I realized I've been talking about your job for years without having any idea what you actually do, she admitted during one of our phone conversations. That's embarrassing. Can you explain it to me like I'm 5 years old? So I did. I told her about client presentations and market research and brand strategy. I explained how I managed my team, how I developed marketing campaigns, how I measured success. For the first time in our relationship, Beverly listened without comparing my work to Tom's job at the bank or making assumptions about my salary. That sounds incredibly complicated, she said when I finished. And like a lot of responsibility. No wonder you work late sometimes. Dennis's approach was more direct. He showed up at my apartment one Saturday morning with coffee and bagels, something he had never done before. I need to learn about money, he announced as soon as I let him in. Real money, not just car sales commission and monthly payments. Will you teach me? We spent 3 hours sitting at my kitchen table while I explained investment accounts and retirement planning and the difference between good debt and bad debt. Dennis took notes in a small notebook, asking questions that showed he was actually paying attention. I had no idea you knew all this stuff, he said when we finished. I mean, I knew you were smart, but this is like advanced adult stuff that they should teach in school but don't. It's not that complicated once you understand the basics, I replied. The key is starting early and being consistent. Can you help me set up an investment account? I want to start putting money away for the future instead of just spending everything I make. It was the first time Dennis had ever asked for my advice about anything important, and it felt like a fundamental shift in how he saw me. My father's change was more subtle but equally significant. He started asking about my apartment, my neighborhood, my commute. He wanted to understand why I had chosen to live where I lived, what I liked about the city, what my life was actually like, instead of what he imagined it to be. Your old man has never been good with words, he said during one of our conversations. But I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've built for yourself. It's different from what I understand, but that doesn't make it less valuable. He even drove into Brooklyn one Sunday to see my apartment, something I had invited him to do dozens of times over the years. He walked around my one-bedroom with its hardwood floors and exposed brick walls and view of the Manhattan Bridge, nodding approvingly. This is real nice, kiddo, he said, standing at my living room window and looking out at the city skyline. Real nice. You picked a good spot. My mother's transformation was the most dramatic. She started calling me every week, not to check if I was okay, or to share news about Beverly and Dennis, but to actually talk to me about my life. She asked about my work projects, my friends, my interests outside of work. I realized I've been talking to the Margaret I thought you were instead of the Margaret you actually are, she said during one of these calls. I want to know my real daughter, not the version I made up in my head. She also started telling other people about my job with something that sounded like pride instead of concern. I found this out when my aunt called to congratulate me on my promotion, a promotion I had gotten 6 months earlier, but had never mentioned to extended family. Your mother told me you're managing a whole region for some big company, my aunt said. She sounds so proud when she talks about your work now. But the most significant change was in how family gatherings felt. At Dennis's birthday dinner 2 months later, nobody made assumptions about what I could afford or offered to help me with the bill. When Beverly announced that she and Tom were looking at houses, she asked for my advice about mortgages and down payments, instead of assuming I wouldn't understand the financial aspects. When my father talked about his retirement, he asked about my retirement planning, genuinely curious about how someone in my situation prepared for the future. When my mother shared family news with her friends, She included updates about my career achievements alongside Beverly's family milestones and Dennis's sales success. The changes weren't perfect, and they didn't happen overnight. There were still moments of awkwardness, times when someone would start to make an assumption and then catch themselves. There were conversations where I could tell they were trying too hard to show interest in my work, or where their questions revealed how little they had understood about my life before. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was being seen for who I actually was, instead of who they thought I should be. I felt like my choices were being respected instead of questioned. I felt like my success was being celebrated instead of minimized. 6 months after that dinner at Russo's, Beverly called me with news that she was going back to work. Tom's promotion had given them financial stability, but she wanted something for herself, some sense of professional accomplishment beyond being a wife and mother. "I've been thinking about what you said about different kinds of success," she told me. "I love being a mom, but I want to be other things too. I want to have my own career, my own goals, my own sense of achievement." "What are you thinking about doing?" I asked. "Actually, I was hoping you might have some advice about that. You've built such an impressive career, and I'm starting from scratch at 30. Is it too late for me to figure out what I want to be when I grow up?" It was the first time Beverly had ever asked for my professional advice, and it felt like we were finally building the kind of sisterly relationship I had always wanted. Looking back now, I realized that night at Russo's wasn't really about money or proving my worth. It was about demanding the respect I should have been given all along, and teaching my family that love without respect isn't enough. It was about showing them that their assumptions about my life were not just wrong, but insulting, and that I deserved better from the people who claimed to care about me most. The real victory wasn't paying that $847 bill. It was finally learning that I didn't need their approval to know I was doing just fine. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who need to learn how to love you better. And sometimes you have to teach them how. But here's what I learned in the process. Family relationships are complicated, and they're built on years of patterns and assumptions and misunderstandings. Changing those patterns requires patience and forgiveness, and a willingness to see each other clearly, probably for the first time. It means accepting that people can change, that relationships can evolve, and that sometimes a confrontation is necessary to clear the air and start fresh. My family wasn't malicious in their assumptions about my life. They were limited by their own experiences and understanding, and they made mistakes based on love and concern rather than cruelty. But good intentions don't excuse the impact of their actions, and love doesn't automatically include respect. Now, when we gather for family dinners, the conversation is different. We talk about each other's actual lives instead of the versions we've imagined. We ask questions instead of making assumptions. We celebrate each other's successes instead of finding ways to minimize them. We've learned that respect is just as important as love, and that understanding someone requires listening to them rather than deciding who they are based on your own limitations. So tell me, have you ever had to prove your worth to people who should have believed in you from the beginning? Have you ever felt like your family loves the idea of you more than they love the real you? Drop a comment below and let me know your story. And if this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family success and learning to stand up for yourself. Share this with someone who might need to hear that they don't need anyone's permission to be proud of their accomplishments. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth isn't determined by other people's understanding of your value. You are enough exactly as you are, and anyone who truly loves you should be able to see that without requiring proof.